Former 82nd Airborne Paratrooper Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson was standing on the pedestrian walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge at 2:15 a.m., looking down at the dark waters 245 feet below and preparing to end the psychological torment that had consumed his life since losing his entire squad. In a helicopter crash in Afghanistan that he had survived only because mechanical problems had kept him on the ground during what should have been his final mission, Marcus had driven from his apartment in Oakland with a carefully written suicide note and specific instructions for his family, convinced that jumping from the bridge would finally silence the survivor's guilt and PTSD symptoms that made each day feel like a betrayal of the brothers who had died while he remained alive through pure chance. The pre-dawn hours provided the privacy he needed to complete his plan without intervention from bridge patrol officers or well-meaning civilians who couldn't understand the weight of carrying 11 sets of dog tags that belonged to better soldiers than he believed himself to be. But Zulu, his specially trained PTSD service dog, who had been sleeping in the back seat of Marcus's car, had awakened when his veteran failed to return and activated search protocols that his training had prepared him for when veterans with severe depression reached crisis points that exceeded their ability to make rational decisions about their own survival. For 47 minutes on the bridge span, where hundreds of people had ended their lives, Zulu used every technique in his crisis intervention arsenal to keep Marcus away from the railing while providing the kind of behavioral therapy that could help his veteran remember reasons to choose life over the permanent solution to temporary pain that suicide represented. Welcome to Saved by Tales. Before we dive into this deeply emotional story of invisible wounds meeting crisis intervention and a service dog's determination to protect his veteran from the ultimate enemy that claimed more military lives than combat operations, join our community of animal hero enthusiasts who understand that some battles continue long after deployment ends, and that survival sometimes requires four-legged therapists whose training can detect when heroes need saving from themselves. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson had completed 4 deployments with the 82nd Airborne before the helicopter crash in Afghanistan that killed his entire squad while he remained on base due to equipment malfunction that had saved his life in the cruelest possible way. Marcus was one of our most dedicated paratroopers, his former platoon leader, Captain David Rodriguez, would later reflect. But survivor's guilt can destroy even the strongest soldiers when they can't understand why they lived while better men died. Marcus's transition to civilian life had been complicated by severe PTSD symptoms and depression that intensified during the anniversary periods surrounding his squad's death, creating crisis episodes that threatened his survival. Zulu, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois, had been specially trained as a PTSD service dog with additional crisis intervention capabilities, including suicide prevention protocols for veterans whose depression reached life-threatening levels. Zulu isn't just Marcus's companion, explained service dog trainer Dr. Sarah Walsh. He's trained to recognize suicidal ideation and provide behavioral interventions that can interrupt dangerous thought patterns before they lead to fatal actions. Marcus's suicidal crisis had been building for weeks as the 3rd anniversary of his squad's death approached, triggering memories and guilt that overwhelmed his usual coping mechanisms and therapy progress. "I should have been on that helicopter," Marcus had confided to his VA counselor during their last session 2 weeks earlier. 11 better soldiers died because I was dealing with equipment problems. They deserved to come home, not me. The progression from suicidal thoughts to concrete planning had accelerated during the past 72 hours as Marcus wrote letters, organized his affairs, and selected the Golden Gate Bridge as his chosen method. Zulu's training included detection of behavioral changes that indicated veterans were moving from ideation to planning phases of suicide crisis, but Marcus had become increasingly secretive about his intentions. Zulu has been more protective and vigilant lately, Marcus's neighbor, Jennifer Martinez, had observed. That dog seemed to sense something was wrong, even when Marcus appeared to be functioning normally. Marcus's drive to the Golden Gate Bridge at 2 a.m. was intended to provide privacy and avoid intervention from bridge patrol or civilian witnesses who might interfere with his plan to end his psychological suffering. "I had it all planned out," Marcus would later tell his therapist. "I thought if I did it quietly in the middle of the night, no one would try to stop me and it would be over quickly." Zulu had been sleeping in the back seat during the drive, but his service dog training had conditioned him to monitor Marcus's behavior, even during rest periods when crisis indicators might emerge. The Belgian Malinois awakened when Marcus parked and began walking toward the bridge pedestrian area, immediately recognizing that his veteran's behavior patterns indicated an escalating crisis situation. Zulu's initial response was to follow Marcus at a distance while assessing the environment and his veteran's emotional state for indicators that would determine the appropriate level of intervention. Zulu's detection of Marcus's suicidal intent was immediate when he saw his veteran approaching the bridge railing with the kind of purposeful determination that his training had taught him to recognize as imminent danger. "Zulu came up behind me when I was looking over the edge," Marcus recalled. "I hadn't expected him to follow me, but there he was, positioning himself between me and the railing." The Belgian Malinois' crisis intervention training activated as he began systematic behaviors designed to interrupt suicidal actions and provide grounding techniques that could help veterans reconnect with reasons for living. Zulu's initial intervention was physical positioning that created barriers between Marcus and the bridge railing while providing calming presence that could help reduce the intensity of suicidal ideation. "Move, Zulu," Marcus said quietly, not wanting his loyal companion to witness what he believed was necessary to end his psychological pain and guilt. Zulu's refusal to move away from Marcus triggered the next phase of his crisis intervention protocol, beginning systematic behaviors designed to ground his veteran in present-moment reality rather than trauma memories. The Belgian Malinois began deep pressure therapy by leaning against Marcus's legs while providing tactile stimulation that could help interrupt dissociative states and reconnect him with physical sensations. "Zulu was doing all his trained behaviors," Marcus observed later. "The deep pressure, the alert positioning, the way he kept making me focus on him instead of the water below." Zulu's training included specific techniques for redirecting attention away from suicide methods and toward positive stimuli that could help veterans remember connections and responsibilities that made life worth preserving. The service dog's persistent behavioral interventions began creating cognitive disruption that challenged Marcus's tunnel vision focus on ending his life as the only solution to his psychological pain. Zulu's crisis intervention included retrieving behaviors that brought Marcus personal items designed to trigger positive memories and emotional connections that could counteract suicidal ideation. The Belgian Malinois returned to Marcus's car and retrieved a photo of his squad that Marcus carried as a reminder of his lost brothers, but Zulu's training recontextualized the image as a reason for living rather than dying. "When Zulu brought me that photo, something shifted," Marcus would later explain. "Instead of seeing it as proof that I should be dead with them, I started remembering that they would want me to live." Zulu's behavioral intervention included specific techniques for helping veterans reframe survivor guilt as survivor responsibility, transforming the burden of living into a mission of honoring those who had died. The service dog's patient persistence gradually helped Marcus begin considering perspectives other than suicide as solutions to his psychological pain and feelings of unworthiness. After 30 minutes of behavioral intervention, Zulu's crisis protocols included activating Marcus's emergency communications system to contact mental health crisis counselors who could provide professional support. "This is Dr. Martinez from the VA crisis line," came the voice through Marcus's emergency communicator. "Zulu has activated your crisis alert. Are you safe right now, Marcus?" Marcus's initial response was silence as he processed the reality that his service dog had intervened in what he considered a private decision about ending his psychological suffering. "Marcus, this is your crisis counselor," Dr. Martinez continued. "Zulu is trained to alert us when he detects you're in immediate danger. Can you tell me where you are right now?" Zulu maintained his protective positioning while the crisis counselor began the conversation that could help Marcus reconsider his decision and accept professional mental health support. Dr. Martinez's crisis intervention expertise guided the conversation as Marcus gradually began expressing the survivor guilt and PTSD symptoms that had brought him to the breaking point where ending his life seemed like the only solution. "I can't live with knowing they died while I stayed behind," Marcus finally admitted. Every day I wake up is another day I'm alive when better soldiers are dead. Zulu's presence provided emotional grounding throughout the conversation as Dr. Martinez helped Marcus understand that survivor guilt was a symptom of his PTSD, not evidence that he didn't deserve to live. Zulu knows you're in pain, Dr. Martinez observed. That's why he's intervening. He's been trained to recognize when veterans need help, and he's telling us that your life has value worth protecting. The Belgian Malinois' continued behavioral interventions included comfort-seeking behaviors that demonstrated his bond with Marcus and provided physical evidence of connections that made life meaningful. Crisis response teams arrived at the Golden Gate Bridge within 30 minutes of Zulu's alert, finding Marcus still in crisis but engaged in conversation with counselors and no longer actively attempting to harm himself. "We're here to help, not to judge," said crisis counselor Jennifer Walsh as she approached Marcus with mental health specialists. "Zulu did exactly what he was trained to do by getting us involved." Marcus's initial resistance to emergency intervention gradually decreased as he recognized that the professional responders understood PTSD and treated his crisis as a medical emergency rather than a character failure. "Zulu saved my life," Marcus admitted as crisis counselors prepared to transport him to the VA Medical Center for immediate psychiatric evaluation and treatment enhancement. The Belgian Malinois remained close to Marcus throughout the emergency response, providing continued support while professional mental health teams took over the intervention that his alert had initiated. Marcus's crisis intervention at the VA Medical Center included immediate psychiatric evaluation, medication adjustment, and enhanced therapy protocols, designed to address the severe survivor guilt and PTSD symptoms that had led to his suicidal crisis. Marcus's service dog prevented what could have been a completed suicide, reported psychiatrist Dr. Robert Kim during Marcus's assessment. "Zulu's training and intervention gave us the opportunity to provide enhanced treatment before Marcus's crisis reached a fatal conclusion." Zulu was allowed to remain with Marcus throughout his psychiatric hospitalization, providing continued support and behavioral interventions that complemented professional mental health treatment. The crisis experience led to revised treatment approaches that incorporated Zulu's observations and alerts as important indicators of Marcus's psychological state and treatment effectiveness. "Zulu monitors Marcus's condition 24 hours a day," Dr. Kim noted. "His alerts provide early warning of developing crises that allow us to intervene before symptoms become life-threatening." Marcus's recovery from his suicidal crisis was gradual and required intensive therapy, medication adjustments, and enhanced support systems that included both professional mental health services and Zulu's continued behavioral interventions. "I'm grateful Zulu didn't let me make that decision," Marcus reflected during group therapy sessions. "I was in so much pain that I couldn't see any other options, but he knew I was worth saving even when I didn't." The crisis experience strengthened the bond between Marcus and Zulu while demonstrating the life-saving value of properly trained PTSD service dogs who could provide interventions that human supporters might not recognize. Zulu's behavior gradually returned to normal as Marcus's psychological state stabilized, but the Belgian Malinois maintained enhanced vigilance that his training had taught him following crisis episodes. Marcus's crisis brought his family together in ways that his previous PTSD struggles hadn't achieved, creating understanding and support systems that enhanced his recovery and reduced his sense of isolation. "We didn't realize how close we came to losing Marcus," his sister Lisa Thompson admitted during family therapy sessions. "Zulu's intervention showed us that we needed to be more involved in supporting Marcus through his PTSD." The family's education about PTSD, survivor guilt, and crisis recognition helped create a support network that complemented Zulu's professional training and behavioral interventions. Marcus's willingness to discuss his psychological struggles increased as he recognized that his crisis had demonstrated the importance of accepting help rather than fighting his battles alone. Marcus's experience with Zulu's life-saving intervention led him to become an advocate for PTSD, service dog programs, and veteran suicide prevention, sharing his story to help other veterans understand that seeking help was a sign of strength. "Zulu saved my life by doing exactly what he was trained to do," Marcus explained during speaking engagements at veteran organizations. "Service dogs can provide interventions that humans might miss, and they're available 24 hours a day when crisis strikes. The partnership between Marcus and Zulu was featured in PTSD education programs and service dog training curricula, highlighting the potential for specially trained animals to serve as life-saving resources for veterans. 2 years after Zulu's bridge intervention, Marcus continued his mental health treatment with enhanced stability and coping skills, supported by his service dog's ongoing behavioral monitoring and intervention capabilities. "Some days are still harder than others," Marcus acknowledged during follow-up appointments. "But Zulu helps me recognize when I'm struggling before it becomes a crisis, and I have support systems now that I didn't understand before." The Belgian Malinois' role evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing psychological support, demonstrating the long-term value of PTSD service dog partnerships for veterans managing chronic mental health conditions. Years later, Marcus continued sharing his story and advocating for veteran mental health resources, with Zulu remaining by his side as both service dog and symbol of hope for veterans facing similar psychological battles. "Zulu didn't just save my life that night on the bridge," Marcus would tell audiences. "He gave me the chance to discover that recovery was possible and that my survival could honor my fallen brothers by helping other veterans who were struggling like I was." Their partnership demonstrated that some battles require four-legged soldiers who never leave their posts and whose training can recognize when warriors need saving from wars that continue long after they come home from deployment. Zulu had proven that the most important victories sometimes happen when specially trained animals refuse to let their veterans surrender to invisible enemies that threaten to claim more military lives than any foreign adversary ever could. I still think about that foggy San Francisco morning when a decorated paratrooper stood on the Golden Gate Bridge, believing that joining his fallen squad members was the only way to silence the guilt that made each breath feel like theft from better soldiers who would never breathe again. While his carefully planned suicide seemed like the honorable solution to the dishonor of surviving when leadership and luck had kept him on the ground during his unit's final mission. If Zulu had remained asleep in the car, if he'd lacked the specialized training to detect suicidal intent, if he'd been anything less than a crisis interventionist who understood that some veterans need their service dogs to become their lifelines when survivor guilt transforms gratitude into unbearable burden, Marcus Thompson would have become another statistic in the epidemic of veteran suicide that claims 22 lives every day, while families and communities remain unaware that their heroes are losing battles against invisible enemies that follow them home from war. Zulu's story teaches us something profound about the ongoing wars that our veterans fight against psychological wounds that can be more deadly than any combat injury, and the specialized partnerships that can provide life-saving interventions when depression and guilt create perfect storms that threaten those who survived foreign battlefields, only to face defeat in the supposed safety of civilian life.